last year's level, which was pretty much augmented by the big United Biscuits purchased by Yildiz. Yildiz unfortunately couldn't be here. They're busy selling. This year's numbers have gone down quite significantly. Yes. Do we see a rebound? I think so as of recent weeks. So that's why we're having this panel here. I would like to introduce my fellow panelists here. And in fact, I've known all of them for quite a few years, except for you. But so we have Onsun Kaya, Head of Corporate Finance Turkey, TB, BNP Paribas. She has roundabout 17 years of investment banking, corporate finance, M&A experience. We have Dr. Kadri Özgün, Director of the Cement Group at Sabancı Holding. He has 16 years of M&A, corporate finance, and private equity experience. And we have Aaron Kursun, partner at Asin Attorney Partnership, aka Baker McKenzie. He specializes also in M&A with particular focus on private equity, and if I calculated that correctly, you have at least 10 years of experience. And last but not least, we have Gökçe Manav, Director, Global Investment House, 11 years of private equity and corporate finance experience. And you have me, the data room guy, Merrill Data Site, 8 years of experience of being in between all of them, in a way. And as we will hopefully establish here, the data room is always an instrument that you should not underestimate, because it can make the whole deal go well, but it can also make it go very south. So, to start off, we are looking at what exactly is driving Turkish corporates to engage in outbound M&A activity. Kadri, being the corporate here at the table, do you want to give us a start?
Sure. We as Sabancı, we are operating in different industries. And when we look at opportunities outside of Turkey, we have a couple of criteria for us. And one is the companies or the operations should be the ones that we are operating in Turkey. And the other one is the jurisdictions, because for the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, we have looked at different jurisdictions, different countries with different dynamics. And all of a sudden you came up with different obstacles in those jurisdictions, and then you learned your lessons and you moved to the next deal. We realized that, for example, in cement business, cement is a commodity that likes emerging markets, but unfortunately when you're looking at opportunities in your neighboring countries, you see that there are a lot of problems in terms of politics and economics. So you need to shift your focus depending on what would be the real dynamics in the business, but you need to also take good care of the politics and the relationships of those countries with Turkey. I could give you a live example. For example, we looked at an opportunity in Egypt. I'm free to say it now. And then it went quite good for up to a certain point, and then there was a change in the regime. And the President Sisi came in to picture, and all of a sudden we Turks became persona non grata in the country. So it is something that you cannot control, of course, but it is something that you should carefully take good care and then take the pulse of the dynamics in those countries. Again, since this is something that you need to focus on, especially in emerging markets, mostly in our neighboring countries, the political turbulences and the grounds are quite slippery these days because of the Arab Spring, because of the tension between our neighbors. What we are looking at, of course, a stable economy, because at the end of the day, if you're going to do some heavy investments in some of those countries, you need to make sure that your company, your establishment will stay there with no political turbulences or economic turbulences quite a long time. And of course, the upside potential, either in terms of business or the market itself or the company. There are some good adjustment opportunities in some companies that you know that with your experience you can go and switch some buttons and then you can make a better performance out of those companies. And there are some countries that you know that in the future they will provide you some good returns. So there are a lot of combinations and components of what you're looking at before you go into a foreign investment. But we as Sabancı, we at least know that too unknown is quite difficult for us to bet on, meaning that you don't know the country if you're not still operating in those countries. So at least we have to have an experience in the industries that we are operating. Because if you, for example, as Sabancı, if we go into German market as a telecom operator, that would be too unknown for us, and that would be too difficult to mitigate. Because again, as a group, we are looking at up to a certain size of the investments. We are looking some sizable investments. So basically what we're looking at the potential of the company and the country itself, stability in terms of economics and politics, and the upside potential in the foreseeable future.
Okay. Monsoon,
yeah.
what is your experiences?
Well, as being on the advisor side, on the banking side, I can give you a more broader picture of what corporates are looking when they're looking at outbound M&A. And we're having a lot of conversations with most of our clients from medium-sized to large corps these days. What I see most is, and maybe let's be a bit of on the controversial side here, I think now Turkish corporates are more than ever looking for diversification of market risk. Call it the political risk or economic risk, but they're clearly, I think, looking to diversify. I think we're at a point where Turkish corporates are now feeling more confident about their businesses, about their capital, but now they're also seeing that to utilize it in a more efficient manner, they cannot rely on Turkey, just Turkey anymore. So it's either diversification through finding new markets for their products, meaning utilizing what's here in the capacity, from a capacity and know-how perspective, products perspective, finding new markets. So distribution is very important. Or they're looking to attach themselves with a new label, meaning it has to be an international or a more global label. So it's either a brand or a more globally recognized name, that kind of thing. Obviously, jurisdiction in where they're trying to invest is very, very important. But these are, as far as I can see, the main reasons, and I can tell you it's really in various industries, and it's no longer just the play or the new game for the large corps, but also the mid-caps as well, to the extent they can manage.
Okay. Kaksha?
Yeah, thinking about our portfolio companies, I mean, Outbound M&A, we tried to use that as a tool to overcome custom barriers in some countries because it's, I mean, you know, the protectionism in the economy rises up nowadays, and there are huge efforts in emerging markets like North Africa or GCC or some other emerging markets for them to, you know, create their own production base. So what we did is we either tried to acquire our distributor in that country, or if we cannot do that, we make a JV.
Joint venture. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then if even, I mean, that might be so possible sometimes. Then we get, if we cannot even do a JV, we do, you know, we buy share options at least. So
okay.
That was the one thing that we use for outbound M&As, and the other is actually, I mean, in some markets like some GCC markets like Saudi Arabia or some other markets. It's very difficult to do business if you are not in partners with influential people. I mean, that's very critical. So that's another thing that we used such a tool to overcome.
Okay, I can imagine that the cultural component there is very important. So when you look at it, you can either say buyer beware, or you can say beware of the buyer. So I mean, as we've seen with the with United Biscuits last year, that I think they've been trying to sell that asset for a long time. I think 3 years roundabout. And question to you, how soon, how early should the advisors, the lawyers come in before the whole thing starts?
That's a very tricky question, and perhaps I'm going to conflict with my own profession, but to be honest, I don't think lawyers should come into the picture at the very early stages.
Ismail, do you hear that?
Crazy.
Okay, I can continue.
Exactly, you can go ahead.
I'm more relaxed now. No, I mean, it's because, I mean, when you have a lawyer, I mean, the lawyer informs you about risks, then you start putting provisions into the MOU, etc. And then the other side sees that you have a lawyer. It's just like nuclear weapons. The other side sees that you have a lawyer, and he gets a lawyer as well. And then, I mean, okay, for SPA, SHA, it's fine. But in the early stages of an investment, the spirit is more important than anything else. The spirit of getting the momentum, getting the deal through, etc. It's more important than putting a couple of enforceability provisions there. Otherwise, when you lose that spirit, you lose the deal. But, I mean, of course, don't be too relaxed. I do believe that lawyers should be involved before SPA negotiations or due diligence, because, for instance, when you signed, it applies to both outbound investments and inbound. When you signed a memorandum of understanding, letter of intent, whatever, you feel comfortable that that document is not binding. So you feel comfortable just to sign it. But the very, some of the provisions, some of the content you have in that letter may not be applicable or enforceable under law. For instance, if you are relying on making a leverage buyout, etc., then if you don't know the Turkish rules of leverage buyout, which is different than the entire Europe, and you are relying on that commerciality to pull a deal through, then it's bad. I mean, it's bad because what you're relying on is not possible under Turkish law. So I would say do get lawyers timely, but not at the very, very early stages, I would say.
Okay.
Don't use this against me.
No, I will. You also need experts that know about the country, the culture where the target is located, right? Onsun, what's your experience? Well, maybe you guys come in earlier, typically helping the buyer identify, etc.
Certainly. I mean, as advisors, of course, I'm representing an international organization here, and that's where we really get a lot of those kinds of requests from our clients. Yes, I think we need to have the local touch. I mean, maybe this goes against some of the principles of some locally established groups, but you need to hold your client's hand at every step of the way, and there are cultural differences. I mean, we have to accept it. Sometimes it's just the way you approach the management of the company you're targeting. You need to find means or ways of communicating in their language, and I don't mean language, I mean, you know, really cultural language. We had an example, we were doing a deal, I'll just tell the country without disclosing the deal itself, it's Italy. And we saw that it is so important to really know how you approach the employees, how you approach the management, at what level. Because contrary to our country's corporate governance or management principles, most of European countries are very professional, and they've been run by managers, professionals. They don't very much see the shareholder, and for them, compared to our Turkish clients, to see a shareholder coming and speaking to them or trying to take over business or facing a shareholder directly is a shock in itself sometimes. So you have to manage all that, and yeah, I do believe very much in having a local advisor, legally, financially, from a due diligence transaction standpoint, to do an outbound M&A.
Okay. Was that Italian transaction, was it successful?
Yes, it was completed successfully, but that took a lot of conversation. That started very early in the process directly with the management. We had to engage the CEO before we had to engage the sellers' shareholders. So that's really very typical.
Also, I think the local advisor thing goes both ways, because if you're talking about a typical Turkish entrepreneur boss, he may be acquiring a company in France. He may be doing the acquisition under, say, English law, but he would want a Turkish lawyer that he can speak to confidently. Someone who says, "Oh, I know that lawyer. He's a good guy. Don't worry. I'll look after you," etc. I mean, that's being local on the other side, the side of the buyer. Even though the deal itself doesn't have anything with Turkey, still most of the conventional entrepreneurs, bosses, they need that Turkish touch, the hand holding, the eye contact from a Turkish person, I would say.
Okay, very good. Now, in your experience, how is this all typically paid for?
In terms of having local
the deal,
advisors?
how is it financed? Is it leveraged? You know, is it rather complex? Is it paid cash? Is it equity?
For us, depending on the nature of the transaction, of course, I mean, it should be a very stereotype answer, but depending on the asset itself, the leverage ratio of yours and the company that you're buying, etc. And there are some very complex instruments in financial markets these days. You can access to capital at any level, at any currency. It all depends on your risk appetite and your financial burden, how you would like to finance it, either through a mix of debt and equity, a basic type, I mean very conventional style, or are you going to put some instruments like debt-like instruments, like share-like instruments, etc. So it depends, totally depends on, and also if you're buying a whole stakes of the company, or are you going to make a partnership with the existing owner of the company. But we usually prefer to go with basic debt financing, not complex instruments, frankly speaking. And of course, an equity injection if required.
You guys pay cash, right? No?
They have abundant amount of.
No, please tell us.
Okay. I think the finance should be as simple as possible. That's my motto. And we go after companies with intrinsic value which can generate returns by itself without getting leverages. So we would prefer the cash generated by the company, for example, to be utilized for further growth of the company. I mean, that's the main idea. But of course, depending on the situation, the company's leverage, etc., the financing conditions, we may prefer also utilize some leverage as well, that as well.
Okay, I mean, I guess it always depends on the target as well. If you structure the whole thing too complicated, they won't understand how this is all happening.
I mean, you have to concentrate on the deal. You know, I mean, it's leverage is of course good if it can generate some value for you, and it should be used. But there are so many things in the deal to be concentrated, to be resolved. We prefer to, utilize this effort, this energy, resolving those issues in the deal.
Okay. And one more thing, adding to Gökçe's point, financing is something that you could touch base after the transaction, if required, of course, but finalizing not losing the momentum, not losing the energy of the parties that they are eager to going to the closing. And I mean, you should have the first target of closing the transaction as successful as possible, and of course as quickly as possible. And then if required, if market conditions change, and then if something comes up with a very lucrative return, etc., you can revisit the whole financing structure of the transaction, and then if required, if it's feasible for you as well, you can refinance the whole deal. But I agree with you totally. I mean, you should focus on closing a successful one in terms of legal and in terms of operation.
Well, from a banker's standpoint, I agree with the speed of execution and all that, but what we see is a lot of Turkish corporates are relying, just like you said, very much on their local resources and balance sheet financing. And I think there is currently ample source of financing for those corporates, especially for like the likes of Sabancı, for example, that these relationship banks are there and ready to support them on the kind of acquisitions they're making. So it's mostly an all equity transaction, but the equity is financed through relationship banks. That's sort of deal. However, there is actually a big capital market out in Europe, of course the bonds and loans, but the investors are driving the dynamics of those markets. And I think it's a bit early for the Turkish investors to start tapping those markets. But to the extent it's tapped, I think the capacity of acquisitions for Turkish corporates will expand as well. But currently, for speed of execution and all that, I fully agree. The way we have supported our clients in transactions is we do recourse financing up at the auction stage, with perhaps the takeout on non-recourse after the deal. So that's the really typical transaction style.
Okay. Aaron, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, small point, but also as stated, when the Turkish investors have their relationship banks, and I mean, we sometimes criticize the Turkish banking sector for the high level of foreign ownership, but it works in this situation because you have this local relationship with, say, TEB, and you are doing an acquisition in Europe, you can use BNP. Or if you have the relationship with Garanti, you're doing an acquisition in Spain, why not use BBVA? I mean, that relationship works.
And this also kind of works with the lawyers as well, right?
Okay.
No, I mean, we touched upon
needing
needing local help, local hand-holding, because the Turkish entrepreneur, of course, trusts the house lawyer, so to say, whether it's the own general counsel, where the scope may be somewhat limited when it comes to pure M&A and serial acquisitions. You need guys like you, but then you also need someone on the other side of the pond who understands the whole target region.
That's important. I mean, we all have those fancy names like Baker McKenzie, Freshfields, White & Case, whatever, but being a lawyer is really about the personal trust, the personal connection. So and that's how you get business. I mean, the business comes to most of the time a specific lawyer, he knows, etc. So if the entrepreneur knows you, and then you have an office there, and you have one guy there that you know, John, he's a good guy, you've done. So I mean, you can't market anyone just because he works in the same law firm with you. You need that trust as well. Otherwise, you'll lose your client in the first place. So when you have that chain of trust, that really works well.
Okay. Okay.
I think perhaps before we go on, to add to all that, the target itself is very important. How well the target is known in that market. To link that to the UB transaction, I think the debt, if you go more deeper in that, it is also because UB is a very well-known UK client, and the fact that the debt market, the investors knows UB well, makes it easier to structure different kinds of financing around the deal. So the target is in some cases as important as the buyer.
True, true. And of course, then you're talking about preparedness. What kind of data do you actually find when you start looking at the target? Is that a one-on-one where you pick the target, like Sabancı picks a target, or is it more an auction?
It depends. Again, I mean, if you have a club deal, an exclusive deal, then yeah, usually you have your homework before you touch base with the potential seller. But if there's an auction, for example, last year Lafarge and Holcim, they had a merger, and then because of the competition authorities' regulatory enforcements, they need to dispose some of their assets. So it was an auction. So in that respect, in that case, if you want to be a part of that process, of course you're going to be one of many contenders. Depending on the nature of the assets, you might prefer to have an exclusive deal with the potential seller, or you might prefer to have an auction type of transaction. And then the data collection period and the nature of it changes, of course. I mean, if the seller has an auction process, you have your pitch book already in your hand, presented to you by the sellers or the seller's advisors, and you have your further questions. But if you pinpoint some target and then you have your own study, you do it at home first, and then maybe with your advisors, if you select them beforehand, you collect some information from the market itself, and then you go to target and saying that, okay, I have a eager or willingness to make an acquisition of your company, etc. So it typically depends on the nature of the transaction itself.
Okay, so asking out loud, how long does it typically take you to close the deal, on average? Just a number. Is it something that ties your team down for 3 months? Then you'd be really, really quick?
It usually
or is it typically
a bit
longer?
Longer than that. I mean, if you consider the studying period, your homework, etc., we have advantage and disadvantage in that respect. The advantage is that when we have our internal study, what should be the potential target for us to touch base. We have the extensive network and the information set about those potential candidates, especially in the sectors that we are operating in. We know our global competitors, we know our local people in those countries. So that phase is, we can speed up as much as we can because of the information already in hand. But other than that, there are some factors, again, that you can control, which is your advisors' performances, for example, your team's execution speed, etc. But there are things that you cannot control. For example, you submit some questions to the data room, expecting an answer from the seller, but I mean, knock knock, who's there, and no one is answering. So it really depends on the willingness of the seller as well. And there are some, again, things that you cannot control, like the things that I mentioned. For example, we looked at the potential candidates outside of Turkey, and then because of this economic/political instability, we say that, okay, why don't we look into Turkey? There are some still opportunities that we can make acquisitions, and then Gezi Parkı happened. So, you cannot control some of the factors. But usually, if things are being smooth and then parties are aligned in terms of the process itself, it takes like 4 to 6 months, excluding the competition authorities' approvals, etc. Because that's something, again, you submit your file, but the speed is something that you cannot control, even in Turkey or outside of Turkey.
How many team members does it typically roughly involve? I mean, of course, we're talking about a
Depends.
global
For example,
large player,
again, this Lafarge-Holcim transaction was a gigantic one. So in that case, you expand the number of people that you're working in and outside of the operation and the advisors. But in a normal transaction, you have a couple of analysts who are doing the homework in terms of number crunching and etc. Some people are on the ground looking at the conditions of the assets and all the licenses and permits and etc. if they are being there. For example, we looked at an opportunity in an ex-Iron Curtain country, and then we realized that although the asset has been in operational for like, I don't know, 15 years, there were no title deeds of the land. And then you say that, okay, hello, you realize that this is an asset of a couple of $100 million, and then you don't have your title deeds, and they say, okay, it's okay, no problem, because the authorities know that we are operating in there. It has been like 15 years now, so there is no worry. But this is something, for example, cultural understanding, okay? When you go back to your shareholder and saying that, okay, we spent like 4 months and all of a sudden we realize that there is no title deeds of the lands, this is something hard to explain.
Problematic.
But I think this is, I mean, I think this is an advantage for Turkish investors, because when
well, yes and no. Yes and
when
no. I know what you're saying, but it depends.
Yeah, I mean, I frequently have these experiences. For instance, when I had to explain to a German investor that it's very common that a company doesn't have a shareholder book, or shareholders may lose their share certificates, etc. You spend like 2 hours to explain that. But I mean, I've seen a case where it was a almost $1 billion transaction, and there was a factory involved. The buyer was like a very risk-averse buyer, and they realized that a part of the factory didn't have the construction license. So they made it a CP to the closing to have the construction license. Of course, if a factory doesn't have the construction license, there's a reason for it probably. I mean, you can't get it after 20 years of operation. So the seller realized that it wouldn't be able to complete the CP, and before the closing, they tore down that part of the factory because they couldn't get the construction permit.
It's a Turkish way of solving the problem.
Yes, pragmatic.
Yes. Yeah, again, we have our German partners, for example. No offense, but it would be sometimes difficult to explain them that this is a normal way of doing business in some certain areas, because when you try to explain them that this is normal, typical in Turkish business people, amongst Turkish business people, they just lost it. They stare at you, and you gave them some time. Okay, you digest it, and then we will revisit the issue.
How long did they take to digest?
A couple of months.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
If they ever digest, I suppose.
I've been
they couldn't
digesting
understand.
8 years.
No, they couldn't understand. They frankly speaking, they couldn't. You're telling them, okay, no worries. I mean, he's been operational for like 20 years. Don't worry, it's okay. The municipality and the governor and mayor and everybody knows about it, and it's okay. And they say, okay, why didn't they get it at the first? So you go back to square number one, and then you say that, okay, it's okay. But yeah, this is something that you need to overcome if you have cultural differences.
Gökçe, a very last experience from you with your 3 assets, etc.
I mean, same. I mean, the gap between German and Turkish, it's the same gap between Arabs and...
I always say the Turks and the Germans are closer to each other than we all think.
We are getting more closer every day, but then our proximity from the Arabs is increasing. I mean, cultural difference plays a big role. To our experience, you know, it took 1 year to establish a JV. I mean, we were on the road for an M&A, and then we ended up with JV, and then it didn't happen. We ended up with, let's say, share options, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. So the government, approvals, permits, and everything are very slow. I mean, people working there doing the deal are slow, but the governmental side, decelerates everything further to our experience in North Africa or some other countries in the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I would like to open the floor up for questions.
Muhsin Keskin, Baker McKenzie. My question is for Eren Bey. You were talking about keeping the lawyers away from the transaction in the earlier stages of a transaction.
Ismail is here.
Well,
He didn't actually mean
and
that.
now Ismail steps in, so
Okay,
this becomes funnier every moment. So, don't you think it's risky? I mean, what happens to pre-contractual liability? Wouldn't it be better to keep them on the table at the very first step of a transaction, but make them behave or focus on the real thing?
I think he misunderstood you, right? You say at the very beginning.
I didn't say
Very much.
call your lawyer before you call the seller. No, I mean, there's no. Again, please don't use this against me at some point. But I don't think there's a limit to being risk averse. There's always risks you can avoid. It's the opportunities you lose when you worry about those risks. I mean, of course, there could be pre-contractual liability, but I mean, in Turkish, I mean, as you know, under Turkish law, that would be a very, very vague point, and it would be almost crazy for a potential buyer to sue the seller for pre-contractual liability, because I mean that would take some years. The result would be uncertain, and the amount of damages you get would be uncertain. So, of course, I mean it would be good to avoid that risk. But I mean, it really. I mean, if you have a lawyer who understands you, who can move fast, get the deal done, etc., fine. But if you start with a 3-page MOU and then realize that you're having a 20-page MOU, I don't think it's good for anyone. And still, you can't avoid liability. I mean, it comes.
Any other question? Did I see someone back there? Yep.
Thank you. Erdinç Ergençam from Emerging Markets. My name is over there, but I left the floor for you to talk. But I have questions for you all. Just other than the conglomerates, I see that some mid-cap and some small-cap Turkish companies are also interested in cross-border M&A opportunities. And I would just like to ask Onsun Hanım, which industries are they from, and where are the target countries?
Maybe more generally, it's as far as we have seen so far, it's more on the consumer side, the mid caps and towards small caps who want to go outside of Turkey. They want to go for, as you may remember, the reasons, they want to go for the brand and the distribution, the access to those markets. They want to ensure that whatever experience, production capacity, product, expertise they have here, that they can use outside of Turkey. It's mainly Europe for those, because they really want a new label. While for the larger conglomerates, it's more of a corporate game, it's more of a regional game, I think. It's more a venture game rather than for these mid-caps.
Well then, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, until next time. Thank you.